Hi everyone, and welcome to this piece discussion video. This time focused on the piece windows-018 Swallowed. Windows-018 Swallowed is the 24th iteration in the ongoing Windows series, which itself is a part of the postmodern body of work. Windows as a series considers and contemplates the way in which humanity is diluted, miscommunicated, and distorted when translated through online interfaces, and the emotional ramifications upon those involved. It is also a series wherein I am actively working through my own internal challenges contemporaneous with each iteration's production, those specifically pertaining to my relationship and interaction with the online world, but then those more broad and general challenges that I face in day-to-day life. For a more comprehensive look at the series, you will find a link to the series overview in the description of this video. Now let's first begin discussing Windows-018 Swallowed, by considering the broader, more conceptual aspects that are involved with this piece. A very central concept at the heart of this piece is what I describe as the connection paradox that we find through the online world. This sort of notion of being always connected with one another and yet simultaneously completely isolated. And it's something that I think social media's veneer of connectedness also affects and helps to amplify. What this piece is trying to emphasize, however, is how reality's recognition, when we realize this isolation, it only seeks to exacerbate it. It only seeks to make it ever more clear to us that in spite of how connected we may feel through social media and the internet, we are more and more isolated. This piece is also considering the way that the internet is sort of a hackneyed means of interfacing with one another, and how ultimately there's a great deal of compression and disruption within the connection itself when we try to make that connection with others rather than it being truly communicated in the way that is intended. So down that line, Windows-018 Swallowed is also really trying to demonstrate how broken up the human person is when forced through this means in a very visceral sense. Moving from that, I want to now turn into my personal connection as well as the emotional implications of this piece, because this is a very important piece in this part of the Windows series. There's a very personal connection that I have to the iterations in the Windows series that surround this particular piece, and this occurred during December 2021 into January 2022. This was a period of lead up into an exhibition that I was having for some of the previous iterations in the Windows series. In December, the plans were arranged very quickly, and in January, the exhibition was actually ongoing. Now, occurring simultaneously within me during this time of the year is sort of a gravitation I have towards 90s alternative and grunge. This typically tends to happen around December and would kind of bleed into the winter as well. And so that was no different for this time of year. So I'm preparing for the exhibition, and the exhibition is opening, and I'm also gravitating towards this music. And in the midst of that, I encountered the song Swallowed by the band Bush, which I'd heard many times before, but there was one moment I had in January where I heard the song and was really struck by one particular line. This idea of being with everyone and yet I'm not. I believe the actual lyric in the song is, I'm with everyone and yet I'm not. And what I was finding with this exhibition was, because of how far away it was from where I lived, I was only able to attend to install. We weren't able to have an opening due to COVID at the time. And so the only way I was able to be in touch with the exhibition or anybody who would see it was through social media and the internet. And as a result, I was experiencing a great deal of extra isolation on account of this distance, on account of this separation. I had truly wanted to be with the work. I was feeling almost homesick from it because I was an hour and a half away from where the exhibition actually was. Also occurring at this time was the prospect of a follow-up exhibition to the same show, which meant I would need to immediately begin work on new pieces, which is where this piece, Windows-018 Swallowed, would eventually come to pass. And so this magnified a sense of physical confinement that I was experiencing, because the place where I worked and lived was also fairly modest and fairly small. And so I was feeling a sense of constriction. All of this, again, going on at the same time with the internet as my only means of connection, made me feel incredibly, incredibly isolated and constricted. And that's truly where windows-018 swallowed came to be, in this beautiful little storm. Emotionally, what I was trying to instigate with this piece is a sense of loneliness, a sense of uncomfortable disillusionment over the circumstances. There's a feeling of being incredibly insignificant that is baked into this piece because it was very much what I was going through, and it was very much what I was having to experience firsthand because of the circumstances that I found myself in relation to the work, the exhibition, and the future. I found my relationship with the internet was frustration towards this facade, that everything felt so fake and so unfeeling. And I was so desperately seeking the opportunity to connect with my work and those who might also see it. And yet I was trapped behind this very faulty facade and this veneer. So what this ultimately boils down into is a sense of torment. Torment by my own circumstances, the own reality I was facing, but then this broader concept that I'm describing when we come to the recognition of social media's veneer, of the internet's inability to truly connect us in the authentic way that we crave as human beings for that social connection. Windows-018 Swallowed is very much an amalgamation of this personal experience and this broad reality, because I was having to live in this reality in a very visceral way that was desperately uncomfortable for me. With all of this in mind, I now want to turn to the composition of this piece and explore the ways in which these elements are employed towards the ends that I'm describing. So you'll notice with the structure of this piece, there's a sense of becoming overcome. I built it to emphasize a sense of depth, to evoke compartmentalization and this concept of constriction that I continue referring to. I wanted to emphasize the multifaceted experience between my personal interior suffocation and how that felt echoed by my dependence on the internet. We have a lot of overlapping forms. We have a lot of depth and this sort of perception of depth. The figure is very broken up and there's an entangling. These forms and these structures are very messy and chaotic and also searching, that there is sort of an endless unfolding back into itself over and over, an unfolding and a folding, an unfolding and a folding that is hard to suss out and it's hard to parse visually. I almost wanted to create an idea of the snake eating its own tail, that it's returning over and over and over to what is ultimately a very grim end. With regards to the words in this piece, there's the anywhere else, which obviously is partly split by that colon, which bears that desire for escape, feeling trapped and wanting any sort of semblance of respite. And then this is emphasized by the ironic internet slang of the underscore and PLS, which stands for please. And I purposefully made it the abbreviation because I wanted it to sort of evoke being squeezed out from this figure in pain, that rather than being able to utter the whole phrase, he is constricted to such a degree that this is all that can come out, that only those 3 letters can fall from his mouth. The parenthetical seep is made to emphasize the tightness and the tension of the composition squeezing the figure. The henna red, as I will describe shortly, is trying to evoke a bit of this blood that is oozing from the cracks and oozing from the tension, and so seep is meant to further sustain that notion and that it's seeping from the depths of this piece, from the recesses. The capitalized ERR, which is a shortened hand version of error and alert, are failure states of electronic devices, and I wanted to use them to create a sense of discomfort with the internet's insufficiency for human connection, as I keep describing. There's that idea of incompatibility and how error codes will be thrown when a process is faulty or a process isn't properly being executed. And I wanted to emphasize that sort of here when we have the human form trying to communicate and the internet trying to facilitate this connection, but through its faultiness, through its insufficiency, is instead a broken down process that is trying to operate, but is ultimately being foregone by the figure, is being interrupted by the figure, is being impossible to complete because of the figure and because the figure cannot be properly transmitted through. Now, regarding the color palette, I wanted to exacerbate the chaos by creating essentially this malicious team of values that are fighting for selfish control and ultimately ensnaring the figure. So that is truly the impetus behind the agency in the colors. There's this idea that I had during the production of this piece of being broken down in the belly of the beast, that the figure himself sort of feels like I am being broken down in the belly of the beast. And that is what I wanted the figure to feel around these colors. That's what I wanted the viewer to understand how the figure relates to this color palette. Sepia, therefore, is very heavily laden and it can't make sense of things. And there are chasms created by it that engulf the figure. Sandbar brown is creating a residue and a dirt and a rust around this very broken machine. As I mentioned earlier, henna red is meant to be a sort of oozing and seeping that is squeezed out from the compression that the figure is experiencing. Again, to echo this idea of humanity desperately being brutalized by the means through which it's trying to communicate because it's simply insufficient and incompatible. Pumpkin orange and cerulean work to fight for dominance, and so they increase the entangling. I wanted them to over and over activate this sense of cycling. I wanted the composition to be very twisting back in on itself, and so there's a great sense of rotation here that I wanted pumpkin orange and cerulean blue to emphasized through an ongoing struggle. Moving away from that, I now want to conclude by describing the placement of this piece in the series as well as its impact, because windows-018 Swallowed is truly the centerpiece of this second major progression. As I described, it really was the major impetus for all of the works that would proliferate during this period of my life and the production of this series. It was placed roughly center due to its keystone nature in this portion of the series, therefore. Obviously, this is not the first piece that was produced following the more recent 15. I mentioned this is the 24th iteration. It is very much in the middle to latter half of this new progression, which would go to the 30th iteration. And again, that's because this piece bears a great deal of significance. This piece was an inspiration point, and this piece would become the hallmark of this period. And with that in mind, one of the major impacts of this piece for this progression is a sense of darkness. I was trying to very much create a mounting sense of darkness at this point in the Windows series, that we have more chasms, we have more confusion, we have more of a sense of a veil between humanity and one another that is actively working to disrupt the way we can become connected with one another. A lot of my feelings around this time were reflective of the fact that the internet is that veil, that we are constantly being trapped behind it, and as a result, it's making our ability to really understand reality itself and one another fuzzy. That's the sort of darkness that I was trying to embrace, that we are darkening the figures and darkening our own eyes by way of this Windows world in which we are forced to inhabit, in which we are forced to occupy because of how dependent society has become upon it. I sought to take more chromatic risks during this portion of the series as well because of the growing sense of confusion. And so that's why the color palette's agency is becoming far more sinister. There's more of an emphasis on the abusive and combative ability on the figure with the colors, which is exactly why we see this piece having the color palette activate as a sort of malicious team, as I had described. With the composition and those chasms I was describing, those were a major compositional tool that I wanted to start exploring. And so I was trying to discover the power of overlapping forms and the way that I could fragment the figure more and the effect that would have. So windows-018 Swallowed was really a hotbed for all of these ideas, despite the fact that this iteration was not started immediately upon beginning this progression, these following 14 iterations. I still wanted to sketch this piece immediately. And as a matter of fact, I really was sketching this piece at the outset. And so that is a big reason too I describe it as sort of a centerpiece and a template for this progression in the series, which was ultimately coming to be named Beneath the Veil _swallow.exe. So I think I will stop there for now. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn more about this piece, and ultimately I hope everything I've discussed will help you to more deeply connect with windows-018 Swallowed. Please share this video with anybody else who might find it worthwhile, and until the next one, thank you so much. Take care.